Good afternoon. My name is Alan Kratz, and I'm president of Resilient Cities, an organization that advocates for sustained government and non-government funding of public projects to reduce the risks of climate change. Welcome to all of you who have registered for this webinar and joined us, policymakers, practitioners, public officials from Augusta, Maine to Washington, D.C. This is the first of a series of webinars that Resilient Cities is producing to elevate public attention to the need for public support for public investment in resilient infrastructure. And what better day on which to begin our webinar series than the 8th anniversary of Superstorm Sandy with Zelda bearing down, and what better way to begin our series of webinars with turning to experts from 3 coastal states. So from Connecticut, Commissioner Katie Dykes of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and Rebecca French, Director of that department's Office of Climate Change. From New Jersey, Assistant Commissioner Dave Rosenblatt of the Department of Environmental Protection and the state's Chief Resilience Officer. And from Rhode Island, Chief Resilience Officer Sean O'Rourke, and with him, Michael Bayer, who recently and formerly was with the New York Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, and now is Managing Director of the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. So let's jump right into the discussion, led by one of our members who grew up in Connecticut, studied and worked in Rhode Island, and now lives and works in New Jersey, moderator Stuart Mader.
Thanks, Alan, and welcome everybody. I'm Stuart Mader. I'm a transportation policy and infrastructure policy professional, and I'm thrilled to be here with our 5 panelists and all of you who've joined us for this discussion. As Alan said, it's an auspicious anniversary, and it's a reminder of the importance of getting infrastructure funding right and thinking ahead, because another storm is coming today, and more storms will be coming in the future. So with that, let's jump right into our discussion. We're going to talk about 3 topics, and I'm going to pitch questions out to the panel to start the discussion on each. And they're broadly going to be in 3 areas: funding, community, and collaboration. And we'll start with funding. And my question to the panel about funding is, of the strategies that you're considering in your states, which offer the best balance between feasibility, impact, and innovation? And Commissioner Dykes, Katie, I'd like to start with you from Connecticut. And what I'd like each panelist to do is give us a quick, no more than 2-minute overview of what you're doing in your state. And then I encourage you to ask each other questions. So as you hear your fellow panelists talk about their ideas, if a question comes up, there's something interesting about their strategy that you'd like to know more about because it might work for your state, ask away. Go ahead.
Well, it's great to be with you today. Thank you so much, Stuart, and everyone for joining us, and especially a special shout out to everyone joining from Connecticut. We have a very active process underway through the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which was convened by Governor Lamont about a year ago, another near anniversary that we're celebrating. Rebecca French, who's joining us, recently joined our department, is heading up our climate planning office and has been spearheading this Governor's Council on Climate Change process. We have actually, inspired by Sean O'Rourke and our neighbors in Rhode Island, we've included in our planning process a specific focus of a working group on financing. How do you pay for this? And so it's been really great to have collaboration and building off of models of our sister states in engaging folks in this discussion. I mean, Connecticut being the insurance capital and having a lot of coastline gives us 2 great reasons to advance these discussions in our state. We have, of course, just looking, of course, climate change is not exclusively impacting coastal areas, but certainly can emphasize that we have the estimated insured value of our coastal property is about $754 billion here in Connecticut, which is 66% of our statewide total, insured at about 1.1 trillion. And so events like Superstorm Sandy should certainly bring into sharp relief the potential exposure. We're also seeing the bond rating entities start to ask a lot more questions around state and municipal bonding and asking questions about resilience exposure, which is a good, scary thing, but also a good thing because it starts to bring together those interests and ensure that we have even more buy-in for those who are managing in the Treasury office, in our budget office, to understand the value of demonstrating resilience investments. So in our state, we just recently had a special session of our legislature that authorized bonding for resilience projects. We previously had a specific focus on microgrids. We've expanded that microgrid program now to be quite flexible to offer bonding support for resilience projects. So really excited to start to put the details around that program. I think that aligns to precedent in other states. But certainly there's an enormous need for funding and many different avenues for getting it. Federal funding for resilient infrastructure is certainly critical to any significant investment. We have built some great models using Sandy dollars, integrating both transportation and housing and environment agencies coming together to work on projects. Rebecca can speak to that. I think through our GC3 process, we're looking at stormwater utilities, tax increment financing at the municipal level, as well as at the statewide level, being able to build on the success of our first in the nation Green Bank, to look at financing structures like PACE that could be a property assessed clean energy that could be expanded to fund not just renewable projects and energy efficiency, but also resilience investments. The last thing I'll say is that one of the big challenges, I think, is certainly getting the dollars for capital investment to build the projects. But the next big, which I think, depending on the outcome of the election, we might see some real activity around federal funding for infrastructure that could be a great positive for advancing a lot of capital projects. But the next big challenge is going to be operating and maintaining. And where do we find those evergreen dollars that can help to keep these projects operational and make sure that we have folks to staff and manage them in a way that we get the maximum value?
That's great, Commissioner. Thank you very much. And let's turn to Rhode Island and Sean our work. Sean, I'd love to hear more about building on what Commissioner Dyke said about infrastructure banks. I'd love to hear more about your strategy and particularly that approach with the infrastructure bank.
Actually, I might default over to Michael Barr first. I think he's really well suited to answer the first question. Then I can maybe provide a few really pointed examples of how our resilient roadie strategy has started to stack some of these investments. And also, I'll piggyback off what Mike has to say.
Great. Mike?
Yeah, no, Sean. Sean, thank you, Stuart, and thanks everyone. That's great. In Rhode Island, we're a holistic infrastructure bank, so we finance a number of different types of infrastructure improvements, from your traditional sewer, road and bridge, to clean energy, to stormwater, environmental remediation. I think, like you just heard, there are a lot of different innovative financing models that we're looking at, that everyone's looking at, whether it be TIF financing, special assessment districts, or things like, impact bonds, mitigation banks, I find particularly interesting. However, when we kind of can bring it all back to what we currently have and what currently exists at the bank, we have a lot more flexibility to invest in kind of climate-related and resilient types of infrastructure with our existing programs. A great example is the city of Central Falls, a really small, dense urban area in Rhode Island, wanted to do a green and complete streets type project for kind of managing stormwater runoff, reduce localized flooding, increase kind of walkability in the city. And we were able to use our road and bridge program, which you would think traditionally only finances bridge upgrades, paving, but we were able to work with the city to incorporate a lot of these ancillary benefits, and kind of really the meat of that project with stormwater. We're able to run it through one of our traditional programs. And we see that, whether it's our clean water finance program, we do a lot of green above ground infrastructure type work, and that's what we're trying to promote, stuff that you can see, stuff that has these ancillary benefits. The other thing I think we're really working hard with our cities and towns it doesn't just take one type of financing or funding mechanism to complete a project. So let's think really broad about how we can piecemeal together different opportunities, whether from federal resources, state resources, philanthropic resources, to get your project complete. We call this the funding quilt, and I'll hand it over to Sean to kind of delve into that a little bit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, we found, in the development of Resilient Roadie and now through our really deep outreach to the infrastructure bank, that this climate resilience stuff is really expensive and complicated, and there's no silver bullet. And maybe many of you have heard me make this comment before. It's more like a silver buckshot than a silver bullet. And we really need to find ways that we can stretch every possible funding and financing mechanism to have multiple outcomes. And, we also learned in Connecticut and New Jersey are all realizing all at the same time that really it's municipalities that are on the front lines of dealing with climate change, and they own the majority of the assets that are at risk. So how can we be better equipped to assist them in identifying new ways to crowd in traditional as well as non-traditional funding and financing? One example right on the Connecticut border here in Rhode Island is Westerly. Westerly participated in our first round of the Municipal Resilience Program, which is a partnership between the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank and the Nature Conservancy to identify priority projects through a workshop. A summary of findings report is produced, and then the Infrastructure Bank actually puts up action grants or seed money to implement on a handful of priority projects. But what it does, most importantly, is develop that pipeline of projects so that we can be proactive in working with municipalities to attack projects sort of before they become a problem. And Westerly was a great example. They participated last year. We provided them 2 action grants for green infrastructure projects and a flood wall around a wastewater treatment facility, a pump station. But out of that also came the opportunity to provide a non-federal match for a FEMA project for a dredging project. That's coming up in municipalities all across the state and in other cities and towns nationally. Great access to federal capital. The problem is municipalities don't have that upfront money to be able to unlock that free federal dollars. And so that non-federal match through the Infrastructure Bank in terms of a low-cost loan was really a great opportunity to push that project forward. Now we're working with the municipality on providing that pipeline of projects and assisting them with BRIC funding proposals through FEMA. And so you start to see how all these opportunities start to stack on top of each other. And the Infrastructure Bank is really playing a leading role in attacking these projects from multiple angles. Thank you.
That's great, Sean. Thank you. And I think you bring up a really good point, which is the value of being able to leverage municipal dollars. When you've got a municipality that's got the funding at the level that they often have, to be able to leverage that and bring in a match, particularly in your case, the non-federal match, it builds momentum. Once you've got municipalities beginning to get those projects underway, it strengthens the case for more widespread investment. So great examples there. I want to just check and see if were we able to get Dave Rosenblatt on the line, because I want to make sure we talk to Dave and hear what New Jersey's doing as well. So Dave, are you there? Okay, well, I don't hear Dave. So what we'll do is while we're trying to see if we can get Dave, I want to go back to Connecticut for a minute and to Katie and Rebecca. And one of the things I wanted to ask both of you about on the funding side, as I was reading the Governor's Council draft report, a couple of things jumped out at me as really interesting. And one is the mention of the notion of a coastal mortgage crisis, the potential for that. And you talked a little bit about that, Commissioner, in your remarks. Talk a little more about that, what that means for Connecticut. And then the sort of coupled with that, the other side of the coin too, is the insurance perspective. Obviously, both the risk perspective, but also the growing interest and the growing emphasis on catastrophe and resilience bonds. How does that factor into your thinking about funding strategy?
Rebecca, do you want to take that?
Sure, Commissioner. Thanks for reviewing our reports and appreciate your interest in all the good work we're doing. So, you reviewed the Financing and Funding Resilience and Adaptation Working Group of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, and that group is co-chaired by myself and the head of the Connecticut Green Bank and Commissioner Mays from the Insurance Department, as well as our Department of Economic and Community Development. So we have a lot of people thinking about finance from multiple areas on that group. And so, clearly we want to capitalize on our expertise in insurance. We also have the Hartford represented on the Governor's Council on Climate Change. So at this stage, we're exploring, first of all, what are some of the real risks that we face that are those insured? Are we underinsured, or are we not insured at all? And we do see that in homeowners. And our director of our property and casualty division, I think this does keep him up on a regular basis of particularly with a hurricane scenario, how many homes and businesses are at risk. So part of the discussion is, how do we make sure that everyone is properly insured, and that those who can take advantage of the National Flood Insurance Program do so? We have many homeowners who decide to drop that insurance once they paid off their mortgage, and they're no longer required to do it. So that's one big issue that we've noted in the report. But insurance also offers an opportunity to capture value. The catastrophe bond is a type of insurance tool that basically says that the insurance will insure against something not happening, and if it doesn't, you can use kind of that insurance payoff to make an investment and put it towards some infrastructure. So it's a fairly complicated tool that hasn't been taken up on a large scale yet. So we're really kind of exploring it and not implementing it yet at this stage. On the mortgage side, we were noting just several articles came out on this in recent months, just noting that we do have many homes in the New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island area that are in floodplains, that are vulnerable to coastal flooding, and that as sea level rise increases, the frequency of flooding in those floodplains also increases. And that could represent a long-term risk for those homes and assets, and that risk could be that potentially there's signals that the mortgage market is realizing that there's an inherent risk there, and people that risk occurring before a 30-year mortgage is paid off. So could you have stranded assets there? So that's what a few articles from the New York Times in recent covered, and we just highlighted that as something we should pay attention to in Connecticut.
Yes, definitely. And Michael and John, I'm curious to hear from your perspective, how are you thinking about those same issues for Rhode Island? Obviously, Rhode Island's a state that's got some wonderful, beautiful coastline, just like Connecticut, and a lot of it, and lots of development around the coast. So how does that factor into your thinking in terms of the risk around it, and also the questions around mortgage finance?
Sean, I'll turn it over to you.
Did we lose Sean? Sean, I'm hoping you're there. All right, well, let's do this. It sounds like Sean may be having technical difficulty. Why don't we do this? Let's switch gears for a little bit. We can come back to some of those funding questions, but let's talk a little bit about—
I'm here, actually. Stuart, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Sorry,
yes,
I, for some reason, was unable to unmute myself. My apologies.
That's
actually,
okay.
Two quick points that I just wanted to build off Rebecca's great comments. I think there's some opportunities, as well as we all know the challenges on the insurance side. The one is we haven't purely captured all the true risk and cost associated with insurance premiums. Also, we're really under assessing the risk in many of our communities, from the municipal-owned insurance policies as well as residential, and we're seeing that in the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, right now. But insurance also provides an opportunity as a revenue stream as well. We oftentimes think about it just the way to how do we use it to build back, but there aren't a lot of ways to capture avoided costs right now as a revenue stream. And so, there's some really interesting models being developed, like organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, looking at things in Latin America like mangroves, where if you can increase the protective quality of, say, a resort through mangroves, is there a way to lower insurance premiums, and you're able to capture the savings of that insurance premium and actually put it towards more preservation of existing mangroves or establishment of others. And so in our region, we look at our coastal conditions. We share Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Jersey, share a lot of the same coastal conditions, say around salt marshes. Is there a way that we can start looking at nature-based solutions, and how do we leverage insurance premium reductions as a potential revenue stream? So there's a lot of tricky ways to look at these things, but I think there are some opportunities that are emerging.
Yeah, and just to build off quickly a little bit what Sean kind of mentioned, kind of two things. One, as Sean talked about how, right, you can't like attach like insurance reductions, those savings. What is that economic benefit of making these kind of broader based resilience impacts? Data is really important here because you see the same thing in the energy efficiency market. You can't quantify like savings unless you know if they're actually going to occur or accrue to someone. And so for the capital markets to be able to want to invest today, right, it's a data play. It's the more data we have about the benefits of these projects, the economic benefits of these projects, later on capital will come because they can count on those savings to help repay whatever debt obligation they may have. And so there's a little tie to that, like what we're seeing in the energy efficiency market as well.
That's great. That's great. Let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about community, in particular, how you think about the role that community members play in supporting increased funding, and how you're thinking about that in your resilience strategies and in thinking about your investment strategies. How does the public play a role in this? Obviously, part of it is people they look at it from a personal perspective, the personal risk, the personal sort of exposure to climate change, but collectively, what's your thinking on that? And let's start with Rhode Island on that one.
Maybe I'll jump in and then turn it over to Michael. I think a lot of it comes down, I mentioned earlier, pipeline. The community members, municipal leaders, they know the issues that they're facing in their communities with regard to a changing climate. So identifying those projects, catalyzing those projects, and building consensus around what needs to be done is critical. And then the all-important specificity. We often hear like, we have a lot of flooding. We need to get better at asking the follow-up question, like, where are you seeing that flooding? Where do you anticipate? The data is telling you that in the future you might see more flooding. And we all know that any investment we make today is going to be cheaper than an investment we make tomorrow. And so being really upfront in that communication with the community is really key. The other piece that we're seeing right now, and we're in election season, we're finding it's incredibly important to advocate to your local and state elected officials to help them advocate for the important resources we all need to be able to do the work that we've identified. And that's true in Rhode Island. That's true all across our region. And I don't think it's an untapped resource. Really that strong relationship building with local and state representatives to be able to advocate for our work. Michael, you have any other points?
No, I mean, I double down on the people, your community, what streets flood. We saw this in New York after Superstorm Sandy. We had these community reconstruction program where we went into neighborhoods, not a whole municipality, neighborhoods in Brooklyn, neighborhoods upstate, and they could tell us exactly where the road flooded, how much rain they were getting. So they were really specific about what happened, and we were able to then take that information and move projects forward. So, getting involved and asking the community what their needs are, I think is hugely beneficial.
Good points all around. I think that point about the grassroots level is a really important one. In fact, Sean, I noticed on your Twitter feed, you had some great photos of signage going in for I think it was the Pleasant Valley Parkway Stormwater Project. And one of the signs had this quote on it. It said, "What happens in Elmhurst doesn't stay in Elmhurst," at least in streams, that is. And that struck me as very effective messaging to remind people about, you often hear these terms like resilience and infrastructure, and terms that can sound to the average person very kind of high level and abstract. And yet a lot of what we're talking about is, the streams that run through your towns, the storm drains on your streets, the infrastructure that really at a tangible level people recognize. And I think messaging at that level is really important. I was glad to see that you're doing that. So let's turn to Connecticut and talk about the same question. How, from your perspective, are you thinking about community engagement for your strategies?
Well, certainly, community engagement is really essential. We don't want people, we know that people are going to be responding to these risks at an individual level as homeowners, as property owners, in terms of where they're purchasing properties, in terms of how we're going to see market values starting to erode. I think some of those articles recently about the erosion of sale prices in Florida on coastal properties already occurring kind of imperceptibly is really, really telling, right? And people do perceive this, and they're going to vote with their feet. What we really need is to have community engagement, so that, as we talked about, the variety of different municipal financing structures that that we've been looking at, those aren't going to happen without people voting together to support collective, planning and investment and new types of institutions that can support those types of resilience projects that will, again, retain value and protect human health and safety in the event of climate-driven incidents. And so I think that's really a kind of critical moment for us to step into this space and be talking about these solutions and what they look like. And by the way, it's not that, while I know I can assume that everyone who's dialed into this webinar is on board and understands the need to plan for these things, we still have, developers and folks who want to develop in some really, pretty obviously risky locations and target them for residential use. And so we're still having those conversations at the same time in a zoning context or a coastal zone planning context. And so I think that's, again, where that collective conversation needs to come into play. What's the economic future of your municipality? Are you doubling down your property tax base on risky assets? Or are you, building in resilience in your tax base and finding ways to capture that value to invest in the types of green or gray infrastructure projects that can protect people and protect property values and give people peace of mind, going forward? I think those are the conversations that we need to have today. I think there's also a really important piece of this too that has to be part of, prioritized in our discussions, which is about vulnerable communities. Communities of color, low-income communities, folks who we know are more exposed to risks of climate impacts. And it really incumbent on all of us that, as we're working on our planning processes and coming up with mechanisms, that we're having a discussion that's inclusive and is engaging of communities directly, because some of these projects end up changing, just the physical nature of a neighborhood. And we also want to make sure that we have good participation and we're listening to folks about what their priorities are for their communities, so that they're part of this decision making.
Those are great points, and that gets into, go ahead.
Oh, I just say that I just wanted to echo what the commissioner said. I'm really glad she highlighted the vulnerable communities, because that's been such an essential part of our planning process around all aspects of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, but also within the financing and funding recommendations. We looked at each of those recommendations through an equity lens and to incorporate considerations for how would they promote the protection of the most vulnerable populations. How would they prioritize the protection of our frontline communities who are going to feel the effects of climate change first and worst? And that's critical.
That's great. And that is that the
Stuart,
equity.
Can I make one other comment?
Of course.
Can I make one other one? Because I think that, this
Sean,
is such an important piece. I think the other, if we're state representatives, I think we also need to recognize the role of the state and how we can most effectively engage with communities. There's oftentimes a level of mistrust between community residents and the big state. And so finding ways to really partner with community-based organizations, faith-based communities that residents really trust, in order to make those connections and have those conversations is absolutely really critical. And we found that out kind of the hard way through the development of Resilient Rhody, and I've learned a lot about how we develop partnership to better define communication with community residents.
That's so important because we think about resilience, and obviously a big part of that is coastal resilience, because that's where our largest sources of water are. That's where our largest sources of water inflows in storms and so forth can come in. But thinking about the more invisible areas, and the equity lens is so important for that, because an inland area can be just as prone to flooding if it's built in a low-lying area. And often what we find is historically some of those areas tend to be areas that have more vulnerable populations living in those areas. So it makes the equity angle of this so much more important. And also, one of our audience members asked a question. It's kind of the flip side of the coin of what we're talking about, which is how do you make sure that the work on resilience strategy isn't, and I'll quote here, essentially protecting the second homes of wealthier populations, and that it's balanced so that it's paying equal attention, or it's paying an equitable amount of attention to the first homes of people who are in areas that are prone to flooding, need to be made more resilient, but are less visible than the beach and the coastline.
Well, I'm happy to take that one. I think, I think as Rebecca said, starting from the beginning of our planning for our governor's council process, we've really applied that equity lens, and that's been very critical to make sure that, as we know that those communities are impacted to a greater extent, that, to the extent that there's state level funding, for example, of our bond program, for example, that we are very conscious about ensuring that those dollars are prioritizing vulnerable communities. That's actually written into the amended language that went through our special session this year as we expanded that bond funded, that microgrid program, to have a highlight on vulnerable communities for statewide dollars, just as an example. But it's something that, it's not a one and done. It's something that has to be at the forefront in every aspect of planning to, policy discussion to implementation, so as not to default, unfortunately, to where, programs sometimes go, which is engaging those communities, that are more resourced.
That's great. And that brings up another question I wanted to ask about. Another thing I noticed when I was reading the report is the concept of a central governance authority as something that's being thought about in Connecticut. Talk to me about the value of that, having an authority that's focused on climate resilience. And in particular, one of the things I'm wondering about is thinking about something that Michael said before about the infrastructure bank in Rhode Island. Is one of the potential benefits of having something like that at state level that it allows you to, for instance, make sure that you're looking holistically at the communities that are getting municipal funds leveraged, getting non-federal matches, for example, to make sure that there's an equitable distribution of that, and there's an equitable attention to those populations.
This is Rebecca, but I'm also really interested in what Rhode Island has to say about this as well. But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. So definitely one of the key issues is how do we effectively work with our federal partners who do have grant programs, and I hope more and more of them are tied to let's be prepared ahead of the disaster and ahead of the impacts of climate change, as opposed to only being tied to disaster recovery, which Connecticut and New Jersey were significant recipients of Superstorm Sandy recovery funds that we have turned into resilience programs. But yeah, those programs require match. They require good governance. They require entities who have all the authorities to acquire land, to negotiate, to build, to construct, and a very particular type of expertise, on the, be it flood walls and pump stations, or green infrastructure solutions like living shorelines and bioswales or rain gardens. It's a particular suite of expertise, and also a whole set of authorizations that you need to be able to implement projects that those programs are funding.
Yeah, I just echoing or building off of Rebecca's comment there, again, thinking about getting the project built is just the beginning. Because having, as an agency that has responsibility for hundreds of state-owned dams, for example, we know what it takes to maintain infrastructure for decades. and ensuring that they infrastructure is able to operate, that preventive maintenance is happening, that monitoring is happening about infrastructure conditions. And so, those may be things that at a regional level, or I know it's like talking about this in the Northeast is always fun because we have no county government in essence here in Connecticut, but groups of municipalities or at the state level, I think we always have to keep our eye on where there are efficiencies at scale to take over some of those operational and maintenance responsibilities and deliver them more effectively. The other thing I would also emphasize, I love Sean and Michael's comments about measurement. There is tremendous value here in avoided impacts, but it's very difficult to measure. I think the energy efficiency experience is very on point here. People are getting better at managing and measuring the risk and estimating the risk, and even having more transparency about the risk at an individual property level. But the possibility of a state level or a regional authority, may provide for an entity that could perform some of that measurement of avoided costs that becomes the basis for the markets, insurance, financing, so on, to value that mitigation benefit, and then being able to base, unlock a whole lot of different financing mechanisms that could be built around that kind of measurement. So I think that's another kind of function that's been missing that may be helpful to develop.
That's a great segue into our third topic, which is about really the question of collaboration between states and thinking about multi-state strategies. And so let's jump into that one. And it's a two-part question. The first piece of it is, what opportunities do you see for funding mitigation and climate mitigation adaptation on a multi-state basis, both in terms of state collaboration, multi-state collaboration, interstate, but also in terms of thinking regionally, in terms of when does it make more sense to think about having a regional body that's got shared governance? What's the threshold for that? And then the second, so let's do that first piece of the question, and then I'll go into the second one, which gets into activating the private sector.
I showed Dave Rosenblatt on the air here.
Dave, are you there? Can you hear us?
I don't think he can hear us, Frank. Yeah, we're trying to get him in, but I don't think it's happening. Thanks for doing that, Frank.
He looks like he's
okay.
muted, but he's on the air here.
Yeah, he's here, but he's unable to unmute for some reason. There's a technical issue. Thank you.
All right, we'll have to do a follow-up webinar and make sure we have Dave on for that. So let's talk about that question of multi-state collaboration. Commissioner Dykes, would you like to take that one first?
Sure. Well, we have a great track record here in New England and across the Northeast of multi-state collaboration. Just thinking about our COVID response, I know it has caused our states to be in constant communication, and we see a lot of those benefits. In this context, I think that there's opportunities for collaboration both on the planning and infrastructure side, as well as on the financing and infrastructure side. As one example, we are participating with New Jersey and Rhode Island and a host of other Northeast states in the Transportation and Climate Initiative, where we're looking at a multi-state cap and invest program that could be implemented in the transportation sector to develop funding that can be invested in climate mitigation solutions for transportation, but that could also contribute to more resilient investment in more resilient transportation infrastructure. I know we share a lot of interstate and rail corridor and so on, and certainly ensuring that we have adequate planning and incorporation of resilience in how we're investing and operating those interstate type of assets is really critical. So those are just a couple of examples, but I think that there's also that even if we don't formally coordinate, there's also that informal coordination that happens as there's cross-pollination of ideas and that travel across borders as we are able to see what's working and hear from stakeholders about models that they really appreciate that other states are implementing.
Great points, and there's a very tangible illustration of that interplay between transportation and resilience in Connecticut. Much of the the Northeast corridor that runs in Connecticut runs through coastal areas that are very much, in the realm of what we're talking about here. And that, go ahead. And that plays to Rhode Island too. Some of it runs through coastal areas in Rhode Island as well. So let's talk about that from your perspective, from Rhode Island.
Sure. Yeah, sure. It's an interesting follow-on to the previous conversation about governance. One of the things that we find is that this climate change and resilience work is everybody's problem, so therefore it's nobody's problem. And so, and it spans across multiple agencies and departments and up and down from local to state government. And so how do you create an ownership structure that can really drive action? And, there's agencies in Rhode Island, and I know deep in Connecticut, and Commissioner Dykes' leadership has really kind of taken ownership of a lot of this work. And so how do we then extract that to a regional potential? I think is sort of the next level to move forward. One of the couple ideas that come to mind are, identifying common projects and needs regionally. So we already heard about the need for dams, and we have 669 dams in Rhode Island that need help. Our roads are aging, culverts are undersized all over the state. Shoreline restoration and erosion issues are happening not just in Rhode Island, but north in Massachusetts and south and west in Connecticut. So if there's a way that we could start to think about regional procurement opportunities, I think we might be able to really lower costs. Is there one service provider that can do technical assistance of getting projects construction ready, and then finding contracts that can actually get multiple projects in better, faster, cheaper? Could be an opportunity. I mean, we do this with fire trucks. We should be able to do this with dams. So there's an interesting opportunity there on procurement. Michael, there's a couple of opportunities at the bank, I think, as well, to think regionally.
Yeah, I mean, we've learned a lot from the Connecticut Green Bank. I mean, they're a great organization. They were, first to get out there, and they have a lot of programs that fit our needs in Rhode Island. We're both part of the, American Green Bank Consortium, where we talk to others who have a goal of accelerating capital into, the green economy. And we're learning from our friends in Florida, from our friends in New York, from our friends in Colorado about, different financing opportunities that we can bring across state borders. One thing we're doing today is with property assessed clean energy, right? We in Rhode Island have the ability to invest in environmental health, environmental safety initiatives. And for us, that includes resilience, includes stormwater, includes things like that. And so we've, Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, we've gotten together on a frequent basis to figure out how we can kind of coordinate regulations, coordinate policies, so the capital markets who operate in these different states, although we have different programs, we can try to have very similar structures, which may reduce, those transaction costs to participate. And also just kind of how do we talk about the benefits? How do we market this stuff? So kind of there's like a common vernacular about what we're trying to accomplish and what the opportunities are, I think also helps as well in terms of kind of that marketing aspect.
Let's build on that point right there that you brought up. I think that's so important. And it gets into the second part of this, my two-part question, which is, so we're talking now about how states can work together, how you can band together. How do you activate the private sector and to, investment, mainstreaming resilience into development, attracting the capital markets? Michael, you just touched on that with things like common vernacular, with making the ability to look at projects and understand the potential investment returns, the risk and so forth. Talk a little more about that. Let's hear how you're thinking of that. That'll be a good topic, I think, to close out our last 12 minutes or so.
I mean, I'm going to go back to data. Data is really important about what the benefits are, right? Because your revenue streams for municipal projects are taxes or fees. Right now, it's really one of those two, right? If you can look at, future economic benefits if we're looking at TIFs. So how do we think about kind of resiliency and that maybe TIF scenario? So data about what happens and how can we kind of formalize that structure? I think that's kind of one of the main things. The other thing is life cycle costs of these projects, right? Most people think, oh, it's a climate project, it's a resilient project, it's going to be much more costly up front. And that may be the case, but your life cycle cost of really focusing on that, what's that proper maintenance that we heard about earlier in this conversation? How is it actually cheaper to maintain? Will it last longer? Are those maybe additional investments we have to make 5 years down the road to upgrade? Or is that cheaper than building it differently, not climate resilient at the beginning, and having to rebuild in 5-10 years? So I think those are the two things I see that can help activate the capital markets.
Makes
the other
sense.
one that we're seeing, sorry.
Go ahead.
The other one we're seeing is the opportunity for public-private partnerships, and the role of engineering firms, corporate partners. What role do they play, and can they implement or identify projects in a more efficient way than, say, state government? So we're seeing that across the project identification, design, bid, build, maintain continuum. Is how can we better partner with the private sector to deliver projects in maybe a cheaper and faster and maybe a more impactful way, and then the state can more quickly recognize those benefits. So I think that's an interesting model that we're seeing all across the country.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Commissioner.
After you.
No, I was going to note that I think the markets, the private market is definitely something we're very interested in, and how we better engage them. But I'm not a banker, but I am concerned that the private sector doesn't when going back to what the commissioner said about we're still seeing development in risky areas, that our private sector is making investments that is not climate smart. And so we need to have standards and codes that incorporate the best available climate science. And I think we were on a path there at a federal level with something called the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard under the last administration, that really called for an increase in building codes and elevation, and a call for using the best available precipitation data and sea level rise data in making planning and building decisions. And the idea was that infrastructure investments should last as long as they're intended to, that your time horizons need to, if your time horizons are going out decades into the future, that you need to build around what the climate will be decades into the future. So I think the private sector responds to building standards and building codes, and so it's really critical that we do that work from the governance side.
Yeah, and certainly relevant in the sort of using the regulatory tools. I had a conversation with a developer just within the last 12 months. We were talking about a property that's within the 100-year flood. And it's like the payback is short enough for this particular project that even knowing the risk, those locations are still valued highly enough by, folks who are renting or taking out leases for space that it may be immaterial for lenders for those types of projects, which is like hard to hear when you are someone who works, on climate, but that may be changing, as we start to see some of the reports coming out. Markets are starting, I think, to see the acceleration and these event horizons coming within the payback periods for these projects. So hopefully soon we may be aligned in how we're valuing risk between banks and regulators. But in the meantime, I think the other thing for us to think about is like, we have lots of innovative models that we can think about how to finance these projects. How do we get them to go from the page of a policy paper into like real action? And I think that's where the green bank model is so incredibly important. From the efficiency and the renewable side, having the green bank here in the state is not just about it's about having an entity that is spending its time dedicated on marketing projects, on engaging banks, on basically building those connections to bring people together on deals, to get investors comfortable with a completely different type of asset, with having those conversations with individual municipalities. I mean, the PACE was adopted here in Connecticut, town by town, to get municipalities to opt into it. That means sitting down and having a conversation with the folks who are, the tax assessors, and getting into the weeds of a lot of, the plumbing of how individual municipalities are managing their property tax. So that's the kind of work that it takes, grinding it out day to day. We call these transaction costs. Well, you have to have an entity that's staffed with people who are going to go out and tackle those transaction costs every day, because otherwise it will be things we'll be talking about in conferences 5 and 10 years from now. So that's, transformation takes resources. And so having institutions like that is, I think, sometimes the difference between a great idea continuing to just be an idea or becoming a reality.
And that's a great example of something that spans, it spans state borders, it spans municipal borders, educating people. And as you say, it's, going out and talking to every town, every municipality. There's a repetition that happens there that is important, because it's engagement at a personal enough level to make sure that people understand it and they're able to translate the benefits and see it in the context of their sphere of responsibility. But there's also an element of refining the story as you build the knowledge, of talking to, by the time you talk to your 15th municipality and then your 30th municipality, there's accumulated institutional knowledge that builds up about how people are thinking about it that can then be transferred to others. So I think that you're exactly right. That makes the case for it. One other thing I was thinking of as all of you were talking that I think is one other important point to think about is there's the bank side of this, there's a regulatory side of it, and then there's also the rating side of it. And I say this as somebody who spent a portion of my career previously working in the rating agency world. I worked for Fitch Ratings, and at the time I worked there, the notion of resilience bonds, green bonds, catastrophe bonds was beginning to become much more central to the thinking of credit rating committees. And one of the things that they're thinking about, and it's become even more acute now, is we're in 2020, and forget everything else that's happened in this year 2020. But one of the things that's central in my mind is 30-year bonds now mature in 2050, and 2050 is the benchmark year that many climate pledges, many climate strategies are set to in terms of reducing emissions. So it really brings home how much that time horizon is becoming less and less abstract. And therefore the value of educating and factoring that into the credit rating process for projects, because that's another element of standardizing the way that the private sector can evaluate the value of putting dollars into these projects. And also managing the understanding among the private sector to make sure that, as was brought up before, investments aren't made in projects that, they're going to have a great return in 5 years, but it's going to be a mess after that. And somebody's looking at it only on that 5-year time horizon and not from what's it going to look like in 10 or 15 years? And what is there potentially, are we going to be worse off if we go for an investment that's going to make us a little money now, but it's going to put us in tougher shape in the future? We've got just a few minutes left, just about a couple minutes left. And what I want to do is just very quickly, any closing thoughts from anybody, just in 15 or 20 seconds each, anything you want to leave the group with? And let's start with the Commissioner in Connecticut.
Oh, well, I just say this is it's great to just to have the chance to have this discussion. I'm already thinking about how we need to build more interstate dialogue and coordination on these issues. I think sometimes we kind of get pulled into our individual state kind of planning processes and so on, but there's so much value in having sharing experiences and thinking about how we can work together and make each of our jobs easier. So I just am grateful for you bringing us all together in this conversation today.
Well, thank you. We're glad to have you here. And let's go over to Rebecca. Any closing thoughts from you?
Well, I also want to thank you for having us here today, because this is how we have, built up our list of options, has been looking to our neighboring states and pulling from, reviews in the past, put out in the past few years about different financing and funding options. But yeah, it's time to put them into action. And that takes our community members and our residents asking for those to be put into place, doing the work at the local level, if it's a local financing and funding strategy or a state financing and funding strategy. So I know we have a lot of folks from Connecticut joining us today. So this is putting it out to them to hold us to implementing these options.
Great, thank you. And over to Rhode Island, Sean.
Yeah, I'll echo the vote of thanks. This is really a terrific conversation. Anytime we get to have conversations like this across state boundaries, we're all better for it. I think the one thing that we continue to find every day is that, our climate change is this just enormous, weighty issue that kind of sometimes feels like no solution is going to equal the challenge. But we have some tools in our toolbox right now, and kind of starting with this small measurable change at the local level, I think is really key. And there's some tremendous examples of work happening in New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island that we can all learn from. So I think, opportunities like this are really impactful. So thank you.
Thanks, Sean. And Michael, over to you.
Yeah, and again, I'll thank everyone. It's great to hear kind of what others are doing, learn from them, share our story. But building up what Sean said to close is, no matter what type of project or work, no matter how big, right, those small impacts, a lot of those small changes, those small projects make a larger impact. And so we can all learn from kind of what people are doing on the ground. And so it's great to hear, tell those stories, and then other people can really kind of dig in and build off that to move us forward.
Well, thanks, everybody. This has been an insightful and illuminating discussion. I appreciate all of our panelists. Thank you for joining us. And to our audience members, thanks for joining us as well. We hope this was valuable for you. And we will be in touch by email with a recording of this webinar for you to view at your convenience. And please go to our website, resilcities.org, to sign up for our mailing list and get information on upcoming webinars that we'll be holding. And I also just want to end and thank Dave Rosenblatt. I know he wasn't able to join us because of technical issues, but I know Dave was on the line. And so Dave, thank you for being here, and we will definitely do something with you in the future. Thanks, everybody, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.